Welcome to another edition of Osteria Il Centro's My Favorite Bottle. I'm Shelley Hall with Glazers Midwest. I have a special guest with me this afternoon. This is Jamie Satch with Penfolds. He is their global brand ambassador. Welcome, Jamie.
Welcome, Shelley. Nice to be here.
I'm so glad. So tell me a little bit about your experience in the wine business and your experience with Penfolds.
Yeah, sure. Well, I've spent most of my career working in restaurants and hospitality. And in 1999, I had the good fortune of landing a job at the Penfolds McGill Estate Winery as a sommelier working in the restaurant, which I did for about 5 years. Before graduating to become the first ever Penfolds ambassador for the brand. And I've been doing that since 2005. So I've been with Penfolds for 15 years altogether.
So Penfolds has a fantastic history. Can you share a little bit about that history?
Yeah, of course. From a South Australian historical context, Penfolds is very old. South Australia was, the city of Adelaide was settled by European migrants back in 1836. 8 years later, a young doctor called Christopher Rawson Penfold migrated from England to Adelaide with his wife Mary and his daughter Georgina, and they bought a property of 500 acres in a place called McGill, which is just outside of the city of Adelaide. And Dr. Penfold had the presence of mind to bring some vine cuttings with him. So he established a vineyard in the winery straight away next to the cottage and started making medicinal tonics for his patients, literally fortified style wines, which he'd give them for various ailments. Before very long, people were knocking on the door at the surgery, not because they were ill, but they rather liked this newly prescribed medication. And the wine business sort of grew organically from those very humble beginnings. And before long, the wine business eclipsed the proceeds of the medical practice, and you know, they became a household name in South Australia, and soon they were exporting their wines around the world. Up until really the Second World War, the lion's share of wines made at Penfolds were wines of a fortified nature, you know, the beautiful sweet styles. And we still make them today, but around the 1950s, the pendulum began to swing away from those fortified wines and towards the beautiful table wines that we're best known for today. And leading the charge was a winemaker called Max Schubert. In 1951, Max Schubert created a wine called Grange, which is our flagship wine. But of course, in 1951, it was an experimental wine, and it was quite foreign to palates in Australia, and wasn't universally embraced by Penfolds management and indeed other winemakers that work for the company. So for the first 10 years or so, Schubert was on probation making this wine. And in fact, in 1957, the board of directors at Penfolds even ordered him to cease production of the wine altogether. Fortunately for us, he decided to ignore the directive and he kept going. And today, of course, Grange is recognised as one of Australia's most famous wines. And what Schubert did in the 1950s and then, consequently in the 60s and 70s was lay the foundations for the development of a whole family of Penfold wines. There's a range now, a lot of them based on Shiraz or Cabernet Sauvignon, but indeed there's about 30 odd wines in the Penfolds range. So it's quite an extensive portfolio of wines, and they encompass red, whites and fortified wines today.
Penfold Grange is known worldwide. It's probably your most famous wine in your portfolio. What is it that makes Grange so special?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Grange is quite different from many of the other ultra fine wines of the world, because Grange doesn't come from a single specific site like many of the other great wines of the world. Max Schubert really changed the paradigm with fine wine when he created Grange. He realised that Penfolds had tremendous vineyard resources right across South Australia, and rather than obsessively sourcing the fruit from one vineyard, that he could actually go sourcing the very best fruit that he could find in any given vintage from across all the vineyards that he had available at the time. And he focused on Shiraz because in the 1950s there was a lot of really great old vine Shiraz that had been previously planted to service the fortified wine production process. So he had lots of vineyards he could choose from. So the philosophy is much the same today. The Grange is made from the creme de la creme, the very best fruit that we can find across our vineyards in South Australia, both our company vineyards and our grower vineyards. The wine is vinified in a very particular way where we crush into either open fermenters at the old McGill Winery winery, or static fermenters that are stainless steel at the modern facility in the Barossa Valley. And we ferment the wine on the skins with the skins submerged to get really good extraction of colour and flavour and tannin, really good flavour development. And then we run off the must at 3 Beaumet, so it's still sugar sweet, it's still bubbling away, and we get it into brand new American oak barrels. It's always been made that way, with the exception of the 3 hidden Granges that he made in secret back in the 50s, where he had to use the 56 oak for the 57, 58 and 59. But he was allowed to resume production in the 60s, and the templates remained the same ever since. So maturation in brand new American oak. Once the wine's bottled, it's then matured in the underground bins in the winery for some period of time before it's released. Now, these days, Grange is always 4.5 years old on release when it comes out in October every year. So it's already had a sufficient amount of time so you can drink it on release. But there's no question with a wine like Grange that there's going to be a bigger smile on your face if you've got the patience to lay it in a cellar and drink it when it's 20 or 30 years of age.
So I've been fortunate enough to travel over to Australia and visit some of the most fabulous sites for grape growing I've ever seen. So can you tell us a little bit more about what I saw when I was over there?
Absolutely. Penfolds source all of our red grapes from South Australia. For white grapes, the story is a little bit different, particularly for Chardonnay, which is a white grape that we hold in very high regard. We get a lot of fruit these days from the cooler climate parts of Australia. Tasmania, we're sourcing from. We're also sourcing from southern Victoria, a region called Henty, and in the Snowy Mountains. We have a wine in the US called the Bin 311 that we sell a lot of here that's sourced from a place called Tumbarumba in New South Wales in the Snowy Mountains, a good Australian name. But for reds, it's all about South Australia. We've got the bases covered across all of the key districts in South Australia. Now, in particular, the Barossa Valley, which is really the heartland for us and the area where we have probably the best Shiraz vineyards in South Australia. Great company vineyards, great grower vineyards, so we get a combination of fruit from both. We've also got vineyards in McLaren Vale and grower vineyards in McLaren Vale that are fantastic. We've got vineyards in the southeast of the state, in particular a region that's very famous called Coonawarra, which is terrific for its Cabernet Sauvignon, also good for Shiraz. Rattenbully, another good Australian name, an area that we love sourcing our fruit from. So we've got all the major South Australian bases covered with both grower and company vineyards. Now, we actually have 3 kind of philosophies at Penfolds, under the same remit. We make wines that are built to last. Part of the Penfolds DNA is that our wines will cellar. You can drink them when they're released, absolutely. But if you choose to put them in a cellar, you ought to see a reward for doing that after 10, 15 or 20 years, depending on the wine. A lot of our wines, including Grange, St Henri, Bin 389, Bin 28, and the Canunga Hill range, are multi-regional blends where the fruit is selected on its merits to suit a particular wine style. And it's been a very successful formula for Penfolds. This is something that Max Schubert introduced and really flows on from his experience as a fortified winemaker, blending wines to style. So we're able to keep our wines really consistent from a quality and style perspective, from vintage to vintage. But that's not all we do. We also have a big range of regional wines. In fact, there's a lot of them now. And it wasn't like we woke up yesterday and thought, wouldn't that be a nice idea? We've been doing it since the 1960s, with particularly in Coonawarra, the Bin 128 from Coonawarra, Shiraz, wonderful wine since 1962. But there's lots of regional wines in the Penfolds range now that exhibit the character of some of these unique regions we have in South Australia. Remembering that we have some of the world's oldest soils in South Australia. Our vines are putting their roots down into soils and rocks that are 700 or 800 million years old in some regions. And of course, we also have single vineyard wines. And the most famous of those is the McGill Estate Shiraz, harvested from the vines that are planted around Dr. Penfold's original homestead, the Grange Cottage, in the middle of the McGill Vineyard, just a few miles out of the centre of the city of Adelaide. Beautiful vineyard, and that makes a single vineyard wine. So if you want to see a vineyard that expresses that sense of place, or a terroir, as a French person may say, then we can tick that box as well. And we actually make other single vineyard wines, but generally only when they're really exceptional, and when we can produce a wine that is arguably even rarer and scarcer than Grange. And the one that springs to mind is the Block 42, and I know you visited that vineyard.
One of my favorites.
Block 42 vineyard, and extraordinary. It's Cabernet Sauvignon. Those vines were planted in 1888, and we can say that they're the oldest producing Cabernet vines in the world, because we've never had an outbreak of phylloxera in South Australia. So we have some really unique vineyards, both both from the age of the vines and the unique age of the soils, and the fact that we've got such different climatic conditions across these vineyards gives us great depth and scope for fruit sourcing.